Just say it's all been a pack of lies.
It's all been a pack of lies. That sounded really good.
With the publication of this podcast episode, I will have fulfilled my requirements to graduate with a Master's of Education in Teaching, Learning, and Neuroscience. But I don't think that means what it's supposed to mean, because learning doesn't look like what we measure, and what we measure isn't always learning. We just confuse the two because it's easier to manage that way. And the longer that I've been inside the institution of post-secondary education, the more I've started to notice that most of it does not depend on learning happening in the way that I have described learning in this series. In fact, it depends on things looking like learning, and I have done everything right in this structure. I showed up, I've exceeded expectations, and yet I still feel like this version of myself that is doing this thinking is never quite fully allowed to exist in the same space as the thing being measured, which is my learning. The weird part for me is that it doesn't feel like anything is coming to an end, but what it does feel like is that I'm finally seeing what I was doing while I was inside my own process. Because for the past 3 years, I have found myself trying to function in a system while slowly realizing the way that I think doesn't match the shape of the system. And it's not some big outlandish event that took place, it's the very boring day-to-day sense of noticing that sometimes you can be doing everything right and still feel like you're translating yourself the entire time. Maybe the way we usually describe learning just isn't wide enough to hold what it actually looks like when it's happening in real time. In the gap between what we call good learning and what it actually takes to get there when things feel messy. So this episode is all about weird pedagogy, and I'm going to position it as my last and final attempt to convince everybody listening or watching this episode that weird pedagogy is not a preference. Weird pedagogy is teaching inside the fact that cognition does not arrive in order. Weird pedagogy is what emerges when you stop correcting every deviation back into obscurity. Weird pedagogy is the practice of not flattening what you do not immediately understand. Weird pedagogy is what you get when you stop confusing learning for speed. Weird pedagogy is staying close enough to the process of learning that you can actually see it forming. And in this episode, we're going to break it down into 3 chapters. First, we're going to review all of the principles of it. What actually has to be true about learning for all of this to make sense. In the second chapter, we're going to take a look at how you can make the principles of weird pedagogy practical. What changes in real teaching when you stop treating deviation as an error and start treating it like a signal that you are responsible for answering to. And in the third chapter, the part that people normally avoid, we're going to talk about what it costs, the risks and responsibilities of a pedagogy built on responsiveness instead of control. And then we will wrap up this episode with my vision for the future. So let's get into it. The season 4 finale of D-Talk, season 4, said that twice. The season 4 finale of D-Talk starts now. Chapter 1, The Principles Summarized. Weird pedagogy begins as a recognition that the system we are in only works by flattening what thinking and learning actually is. And once you're able to see that, everything else becomes a question of what had to be removed in order for learning to look stable. Now we're going to take a look at the 12 principles of weird pedagogy, and they have to be true for this concept to even make sense. And if one of them catches your interest, you can go back and explore them more in depth by watching the full episode that each principle came from. Principle 1, attention is not obedient. Attention is continuously shaped by context, emotion, and cognitive load. And what looks like inattention is often adaptive redistribution of the limited cognitive resources under competing demands. and models of cognitive control consistently show that attention is regulated dynamically based off of the perceived task, value, and cost, and not moral discipline. Weird pedagogy starts right here with the recognition that attention is always responding to something, whether we acknowledge that or not. Principle 2. Flow is unblocked cognition and not exceptional ability. Flow states happen in conditions where cognitive friction is reduced enough for sustained engagement to emerge. Research on flow consistently links it to clear goals, immediate feedback, and a balance between challenge and skill, not talent or effort alone. In this sense, what we call flow is less about brilliance and more about a temporary removal of the constraints that normally interrupt our thinking. Principle 3. Identity is built through feedback loops and not discovery. Identity in learning environments is constructed through repeated social feedback, evaluation, and interpretation of our performance. Self-concept develops through mirrored responses from systems and others, especially in evaluative contexts where outcomes are repeatedly interpreted as traits. Over time, learners learn what kind of thinker they are allowed to be within the system. Principle 4. Feedback is a selection mechanism. Feedback shapes what kind of thinking gets to survive. Highly evaluative or corrective feedback shifts our attention from conceptual understanding towards performance management, reducing the depth of our thinking. So what survives feedback is not always the most accurate, it is what is most legible to the system that is giving the feedback. Principle 5. Systems determine what counts as intelligence. Educational systems define their own visible boundaries. What becomes recognized as smart is tightly coupled to what can be standardized or scored. This means intelligence is not just cognitive, it's also infrastructural. And whether somebody is seen as intelligent depends on whether the system was built to see it or not. Principle 6. Time is a control structure disguised as neutrality. School is a regulatory system that standardizes our cognition through pacing and synchronization. Cognitive processing speed varies significantly across individuals and context. Yet, institutional time assumes uniformity. This creates a structural illusion that understanding should arrive on schedule. Principle 7. Performance is not understanding under observation. Observable performance often reflects strategic adaptation to evaluation rather than the depth of comprehension, and social evaluation reliably alters our working memory and executive functioning, shifting our focus toward impression management. So what we call doing well may simply be somebody's ability to remain cognitively stable under observation. Principle 8. Cognition is always state dependent. Thinking is consistently shaped by our physiological state, stress, and environmental load. Executive functioning is highly sensitive to arousal levels, fatigue, and stress chemistry. Principle 9. Stress is a part of the system, not outside of it. Stress reorganizes our cognition, and under chronic stress, the brain shifts resources away from higher order thinking towards threat detection and rapid response systems. In learning environments, people who have difficulty focusing often reflect adaptive prioritization and not a deficit. Principle 10. Marginalization shapes predictive cognition over time. Marginalization becomes encoded in predictive processing systems that anticipate threat, evaluation, or exclusion. And these expectations influence our attention, our memory, and our performance through stereotype threat and chronic stress activation. And the brain begins to prepare for environments before it even enters them. Principle 11. Resilience is adaptation and not immunity. Resilience is the successful adaptation to sustained or repeated stress exposure. This adaptation can enhance performance in high-demand contexts, while simultaneously narrowing cognitive flexibility in low-pressure environments. And the final one, Principle 12, teaching is the management of emergence under constraint. Teaching is not the simple transmission of knowledge from expert to novice, but the continuous navigation of the emergent cognition within structured environments. Learning unfolds through interaction, adjustment, and responsiveness rather than linear delivery. The teacher's role is not to stabilize learning, but to stay close enough to it while it is forming. So taken together, these 12 principles collapse into a single uncomfortable claim that human beings only become legible when they are reduced to what can be easily governed, and anything outside of those neat separations are seen as deviant, defiant, or weird. And once I was able to recognize that, the structure of my world, your world, our world started to look like a translation error between human cognition and institutional control. Now, let's bring these principles into the realm of practicality, because weird pedagogy is not an alternative method. It is the refusal to participate in the narrowing of expression as an unquestioned default. Chapter 2. Making weird practical. At some point during this degree, I started to experience weird pedagogy as something I was learning how to see. And there is this really defined gap between actual cognition and what a system is able to define as cognition. And it is visible, but only if you learn how to recognize it. Why do we want to recognize it, you may ask? That's a great question. The answer to that is, the gap is where everything interesting lives. It's the space between what is actually happening and what we can all agree is happening. Between lived cognition and its official translation. Between thought as it unfolds and thought as it gets labeled and scored and flattened into something that we can circulate without friction. And once you start to notice this more and more, you realize that this is not just about classrooms. It shows up in how we describe people, how we evaluate ourselves, how we turn complexity into something simpler just to make it easier to respond to. Weird pedagogy is the name that I gave to that recognition inside teaching, but the mechanism itself is everywhere. And I don't think I fully realized this until I started watching my own thinking change in response to evaluation itself. The way you start editing ideas before they even exist, the way that you learn what kinds of thought are worth saying out loud. Weird pedagogy is what I needed when I didn't yet have the language for that experience. So making this practical in terms of a classroom is not about designing better lessons. It's about tolerating unfinished thinking, accepting the unrest. It's about noticing when you are about to turn something alive into something accessible. It's not that structure doesn't matter, it's that structure is often the first thing that we reach for when we are uncomfortable. Weird pedagogy exists right in this threshold as a recognition that any stable representation of learning is already a reduction of itself. So making it practical does not mean solving emergence, it means learning how to stay adjacent to it without forcing it into a form prematurely. It means holding structure lightly enough that it does not become a substitute for attention, and it means accepting that the most important pedagogical skill may not be clarity, or control, or even design, but restraint. The restraint to not finalize what is still becoming. The restraint not to interpret something too quickly. The restraint not to turn movement into outcome before the movement is complete. Because once you do, you have not taught learning. You have just taught the simulation of learning. Woo! This is good. Okay, my brain is moving faster than my mouth and I keep... It's fine. More tongue rolls for me. Chapter 3. The risks and responsibilities. The truth is, as educators, we are shaping what kinds of minds are able to exist in a system that we are a part of. Every pedagogical choice has a filtering effect in practice. Every correction, every assessment, every moment of let's get back on track is also a signal about what kinds of cognition are worth preserving, and systems are very good at turning those signals into patterns, and over time, they train students to reduce ambiguity faster. Students begin to predict what is going to survive contact with evaluation, and they adjust accordingly. So by the time you see a good performance, you are by no means seeing raw cognition anymore. You are seeing cognition that has already been filtered through decades of invisible adaptation to what the system rewards. And this introduces a problem that cannot be resolved through better methods alone, because constraint is not optional. Every system requires cognition. Every structure filters possibility. Every evaluation reduces dimensionality in order to make meaning portable. So the question is not whether we are constraining learning, because we are. The question is whether we are aware of what our constraints are selecting for. Some forms of thinking will always be accelerated. Others will always be interrupted. Some will become recognizable as intelligence. Others will never even be granted the time to become legible at all. So the risk is not chaos. The risk is premature closure, the quiet disappearance of cognition before it even has the chance to form. And the responsibility here, if there is one, is not to eliminate that tension. It is to remain aware of that tension. It's entering every learning environment cognizant of the fact that everything we do influences whether the kinds of thinking around us are being expanded or erased by our actions. It's what kinds of minds are we systemically making more or less possible. And sometimes that means slowing down. Sometimes it means letting a messy idea sit just a little bit longer. Sometimes it means resisting the urge to translate everything immediately into clarity, because clarity is easier to evaluate. Above all, weird pedagogy begs the development of true presence, grounded in this exact moment. Not in a performance, not in what you think the system wants from you, but just you. Weird, incomplete, and open. Resist the illusion that what is measurable is what is complete, and to accept that teaching at its core is not the management of knowledge. It is the stewardship of unfinished thought. Okay, here's the conclusion. My vision for the future. It's a tacky title name. If we treat learning as emergent and weird, then we are really working with instability that temporarily resolves into form. And that means that there is no final state of understanding, but only moments where complexity becomes temporarily coherent enough to act on or describe. The systems we have built around education are designed to capture those moments and treat them as endpoints, where each one is an attempt to freeze movement into structure. But cognition does not stay frozen, it continues. So what we call learning is often just the trace that remains after that reorganization has already happened. And weird pedagogy is the refusal to forget that very fact. We fix things so we can measure them. We measure things so we can compare them. We compare them so we can make decisions about things that feel ethical. But somewhere in that chain, the actual experience is getting reduced into something smaller than it was. Weird pedagogy is what remains when you stop pretending that that reduction is neutral. It doesn't give you a perfect alternative. It gives you awareness of what is being lost in the act of making things manageable. And it's something that you participate in whether you are designing it, observing it, or experiencing it yourself. So if there's a way to end this season, it is not with a resolution, because nothing is coming to a close here. It only took shape long enough to be spoken out loud, and then it dissolves back into motion. Thanks for watching this season of D-Talk. Holy Okay, it's done. I'm out. It's done. How long was that? That was 35 minutes. It felt like 4. It felt like 4 minutes. Celebrate good times. Come on. It's a celebration.